Alright everyone, welcome to Lecture 3. Today we're going to talk about Hand-Painted 3D Workflow 101, Low Poly Modeling. I know we have all taken 3D modeling classes at school before, right? We know how to model, UV, and texture our stuff. However, today we're going to take a deeper look into all those steps in this workflow and make sure we're on the same page before we move on to stuff that's more complex, such as, 3D foliage, skybox. So yeah, let's begin. Let's go over some super basic stuff. Especially for stylized work, we really need to think about those things, right? Like we do not want a straight face. If possible, we want to add a little more polygons to our plane and give it a bit of a curve. And we want to avoid 90-degree angles. That's, very boxy, very mechanical. And usually if we can offset that angle a little bit, it will look better and we'll get better AOs as well. And for the same reason, we want to taper our shapes. We do not want a perfect cube because the rendering will feel very stiff and harsh. And whenever we stack shapes, we do not want to do like overhands like that. The reason why is all of those topologies, that's being covered by this big box are pretty much wasted, right? You can't really see this box or that box over here. But if you do it this way, you can see all those boxes and all the details are being preserved. So over here, we have another example. Instead of just shoving two things into each other, we want to think about creating sockets so that, the thing can be integrated into the other thing in a more natural way. And obviously, we don't want to do shapes that are repeating. We talked about it in lecture 1. This is literally just 1 versus 1 versus 1, which is very boring, right? And having something like this would be more interesting. And especially, we don't want to do repeating lines. Let's think about, small, big, small, medium. We want to create a rhythm rather than just kind of repeating the thing over and over of the same size and shape. So think about your bevel, 45-degree bevel is the best because usually in like an isometric camera view, it will show off the texture the best if it's 45 degree. Anyway, let's keep moving. So let's talk about topology. This is especially true if you're doing character work. Ideally, you want to have all of those polygons on the character basically be very, very similar in sizes. You don't want to go like a big one, with a small one right next to it. At the same time, you definitely do not want to have some really random topology like that. Ideally, you want to have almost like a perfect checker box wireframe going across a character. And there are many reasons for this, and the most important one being rigging and animation. If you do not have this kind of topology, and when the riggers and animators want to, rig them and give them animation, you're going to see this part, if it's modeled like that, being stretched in a really strange way. So to avoid that, we want to make sure we use this kind of nice polyflow. And over here, we kind of talk about it in the first sheet. If possible, we want to have our shape to be a little more tapered so that we do not have like a 90-degree angle, because whenever we have this kind of angle, like this face will be rendered very dark in certain angles, and also it will be pretty hard to see the textures here. And for this one, if we decide to add some topology over here, we do not want to just kind of suggest that topology. If we're spending the money, we want to really pronounce it. So this is not okay, and this is very bad. And this kind of size is better. We want to make sure everything is chunky so that from afar, they can be easily readable. If you think about games like World of Warcraft, a character's belt would be pretty small, and you want to be able to see it, right? You want to spend that topology for players to see instead of, adding topology to something that's invisible. And also, if you think about games with like a isometric camera view, like League of Legends or Diablo 3, this is more important because the characters, the props are even smaller, and we need to make sure that every single shape counts. Every single shape is being represented, even if you zoom out and having the character be a tiny little thing on the screen. For the same reason, we want to always think about what is the right amount of polygons. Over here, for a prop like this ball is probably using too many polygons. We can probably simplify it a little bit. And over here, this bevel, we can have it or not have it. I don't know, probably it's not going to be visible. Imagine if this thing is like this small, However, this hanging belt, because it's a silhouette, it's sticking out of the prop, we definitely want to make sure it has enough edges so that the curve feels smooth. Okay. So in general, polygons comparing to textures are pretty cheap, but they're not free. So we still need to think about what's the best amount of polygons for each prop. And over here, we want to think about, whenever we create those faces, we do not want to have a face that's like too stretched or too long. That is because when you have a stretched face like that, the texture might render strangely in the engine, depending on what kind of engine you're using. And in general, we want to connect the edges like this, which is a lot safer. Try to connect the 2 points that are closer to each other on the quad instead of those two. So also, we talked about this a lot in lecture 1. We want to really, really focus on the silhouette, right? Do not just do a stick. If we want to do a scythe, try to give it a little bit of details and make sure that from afar, it's easily readable, okay? And not everything has to be connected. This is also pretty important. Imagine you have this spike on the shield, or is this a shield or a shoulder pad? I'm not sure. This is not worth it. Why do we need to connect all the edges just for this spike to be on the same mesh as the plane? It doesn't make sense, right? It's much easier if we just shove it in like that. It's fine. Not to mention, in some cases, when we have some stuff that are, gameplay related, the players will be able to grab this empty bag, go collect 3 gemstones in the mine, and bring back to the NPC. In that case, you want to be able to take out those crystals, and we definitely want to separate those models, right? And by the way, if you're not going to see the bottom side of those crystals, we would probably delete the bottom faces, because the first rule I want to talk about today for low poly hand-painted models is that we never want to work on something that players cannot see. Okay? If the players cannot see the bottom of those crystals, we delete the faces and don't even bother to paint the textures. If for some reason this bag will be sitting on the table and never, rotate around, then we can delete the bottom faces of the bag as well. Okay? So one commonly asked question is, should I separate my armor or clothing of my character on a different texture sheet? I get this question from students a lot. And here is the answer. If the character is going to wear that armor or clothes that we created for the entire duration of the game, then we do not need to worry about separating the clothing to a different texture, because what's the point, right? The engine will load the character and the clothing at the same time whenever you need this character in the scene. However, if you're working on, say, like an armor set for a character where, as a player, you can have 10, 20 different armor sets, and each armor set will need to be its own texture sheet. And that is because if the character and the armor set is one texture sheet, then every time you load this armor set, you have to load the character as well, which doesn't make sense, right? And same thing for weapons. If the weapon is going to be staying with the character for forever, it's okay to pack them together on one sheet. If the character has multiple weapons, then we definitely want to separate those weapons into different small textures, maybe like a 256 for each weapon, so that when the character switch to a certain weapon, the engine can only render that weapon texture instead of loading all 10 different weapons. It's all about performance efficiency, right? We want to draw the texture that the scene needs. We do not want the engine to draw 20 different textures that are irrelevant, that will hurt performance for no reason. So to answer this question, we need to think about who the character is. If it's a special character like the Winter Queen, who's gonna have one set of armor or clothing for the entire duration of the gameplay, then pack them into one sheet. That's fine. If the character has multiple armor sets, multiple weapons, then we need to separate them into different sheets. Okay? It's more about performance. And for your own personal work, honestly, it doesn't matter. If you want to, save some headache, might as well pack everything into one sheet. Doesn't matter. Let's talk about alpha cards. If you understand how alpha card works, it is not hard to understand that it can be a double-edged sword, right? If you have the alpha along the silhouette of a character, it will create very, very organic shapes like those. However, if you have an alpha card facing the camera, it's going to look like one single card. Feels really low poly and flat, right? So when we look at alpha cards, it is important to understand what alpha cards can do to us and think about what's the best way to work with them. In this character, for example, if we want to have, the beard as the alpha card, it's not going to work, right? We can have a super, super organic beard looking great from this camera angle, but what if we rotate? It's going to look flat. For anything that's going to be volumetric, like the beard, the eyebrow, the mustache, we need to use 3D geometries. And for anything that's kind of sticking closer to the silhouette and not as volumetric, we should consider about using alpha card like those. Okay? And for foliage assets, obviously we're dealing with a lot of alpha cards. However, we still have to think about what's the best optimized way of using them. For example, if we have an alpha card and just create like a one polygon box to map the alpha card like this, it won't really work, right? Because in this case, we will basically create all those overdraws that will cause problems. You might wonder what is overdraw. Whenever an engine would render an alpha card, it has to calculate all those empty space as pixels and figure out what pixel to render behind this leaf, because you can see through this part, right? And imagine if you have a forest scene like this, then the engine will have to do hundreds of passes of overdraw to think about what's behind this leaf, what's behind this leaf, oh, there's another canopy card. Okay, I have rendered that again and again. And the more overdraw, like rendering paths the engine has to do, the slower the game will run. So as environment artists or as game artists in general, we might want to think about how to reduce overdraw. Which is why we do not want to map an alpha card like that, because that's going to be creating way too much overdraw, right? But at the same time, we don't want to do this, because if you're doing something like this, we're creating a lot of little polygons, right? Like this simple leaf is having like 7 to 8 tries already, or more, maybe 10. And those ones will have even more. So what happens is, imagine if you have to hook those as little doodads to the terrain, and you're gonna see literally hundreds of those flowers and grass going across the board. That 12 polygon times a couple hundred, or turns into tens and thousands of polygons just for the grass, and it's gonna be way too expensive, right? And that is why we want to think about what's the most optimized way to, use our alpha cards. We want to have a small amount of edges, not too many, not too little. Okay? So yeah, here I talk about overdraw, which is basically, the system will be drawing a pixel on the screen multiple times in a single frame of rendering. Which is like, I have to render this pixel, but I have to think, okay, this pixel is actually this canopy card. Oh, actually, this part is alphaed out. How about the canopy card behind it? Oh, maybe that's alphaed out too. I have to render again. So that's what creates a lot of burden to the engine. Okay? So here we have a commonly asked question. Should we use alpha card or polygon card? We already looked at alpha cards, right? We have, this entire scene basically constructed with alpha cards. Everything has some kind of alpha on it. And in this case, though, there is 0 alpha card. Everything is polygon card. What is polygon card? It literally means you use polygons to cut out the silhouette of an object and make a card, such as this tree and this planter right here. If you zoom in, you can see the low poly edges, but if you zoom out, you can't really tell the difference. The reason why in WoW they use a lot of alpha cards is because the WoW engine is pretty strong at handling a lot of polygons and rendering multiple layers of alphas. That is why doing something like this is expensive but possible and looks cool. And for League of Legends, TFT, because the engine does not support a lot of alpha cards, if we have multiple layers of alphas, it might create rendering problems. That is why we want to kind of go in and cut out those tree silhouettes, make them as just polygons, so that we don't have to worry about the alpha card thing,